Today I'm going to be talking about and building one of the most iconic jets of the Cold War, the British Blackburn Buccaneer, an aircraft that stayed in service throughout the Cold War and even served in the Gulf in Operation Granby. In the 1950s, the Royal Navy faced a daunting challenge. The Soviet Union was building a fleet of powerful new surface ships, including new cruisers that have heavy anti-aircraft batteries and were able to threaten vital sea lanes in the Atlantic and beyond. To counter them, the Royal Navy needed a strike aircraft capable of penetrating the most sophisticated air defenses of its time. Speed alone wasn't enough. Jets like the English Electric Lightning or American Phantoms could fly fast, but they couldn't carry a heavy strike load over long distances at sea level. The answer laid in something different, an aircraft that could fly low, very fast, and very far, hugging the waves, skimming under the radar, and delivering a knockout blow. That was a requirement that led to the development of the Blackburn Buccaneer. The Blackburn Buccaneer first flew in 1958, and right from the start, it did not look like the other Cold War jets at the time. It looked like an aircraft that had been drawn by somebody that had never seen a jet before that someone else tried to explain to them. Compared to the Sea Vixen and the Hawk, the Buccaneer was one of the better looking aircraft the British produced in the 50s. One thing I decided to do with this build was to add some more wiring in the cockpit. Now, in order to recreate the clamps this time, instead of using glue or paint, I actually used a P-clamp from copper wire. So what I did, I looped it back on itself, stuck it through the hole, and then ran all the wiring down through that loop. And once I was happy with where it was placed, I pulled it tight and secured it with glue. And this gave me a much neater look to the wiring harnesses. Something that's cool about Cold War jets is it's before the age of computers, so you have a lot of fuse boxes and relay panels to work with if you want to add this type of detail. One criticism I've normally had of Airfix kits is that their details are soft, but on this kit they're actually quite sharp. There was just a few things I upgraded in the cockpit, and one of those was replacing the clipboard mount for the navigator position in the cockpit. I cut off the original section of the top of that panel and replace it with some thinner styrene so it matched the scale. And then for wiring harnesses in the back of the instrument panel, I actually used some guitar wires, just heated up with some fire, that way it was a little more malleable. Something new I tried for this kit was adding some detail to the seat using some aluminum foil. Now, I received a lot of criticism from people saying this wasn't accurate and the seats are made of a plastic type material or a vinyl and that they don't get wrinkly like this. However, I'm building this jet heavily influenced by the one I saw at RAF Hendon last year. Being a museum jet, there's definitely a lot of wear and tear that you can get a lot of great reference photos of. The nice thing about this aluminum foil on the seat is it gives you a little bit more texture and interest to work with. I could have left it as simple vinyl, but I preferred this look. With the wiring in place and the foil on the seats, it was time to hit everything with some Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. And this went down in two thin coats to give me a nice base to work from with the paint. For the color callout in the cockpit, Airfix calls for light ghost gray, which doesn't make sense because that color didn't really exist back in the 60s. So I ended up using the light gray that you see on the bottom of Spitfires. Now that also may not be the correct color callout, but it was a better match for the 3D decals I had for the cockpit, and they matched a little bit closer to the reference photos I took while at Hendon. One of my usual tricks for detail painting in cockpits is to use a lacquer-based paint and then use acrylics for all the details. That way if I have a misstep with the paintbrush and get the paint somewhere I don't want it, I can either use a toothpick or some water just to clear up that mess, and it keeps everything looking nice and crisp. Once I was done painting the harness for the junction boxes in the cockpit, it was time to move on to the ejection seats. What you might notice here in the ejection seat is I actually did a little bit of pre-shading from the top, the same way that figure painters would use, so there's a little bit more light on the top of the seat. And then I used some thinned down acrylic paints as a glaze and slowly built up the colors. The way the cockpit is designed in the Buccaneer, with the seats being offset to each other, it gives you a lot of space that you can see inside, and it's worth it to take the time to make sure the seats look. Additional weathering was done in the cockpit using some sponge chipping and silver acrylic paint, and then everything was sealed under a layer of semi-gloss clear, and then it was time to move into oils. For the wash in the cockpit, I diluted some Abteilung Starship Filth oil paint with some enamel thinner, and the idea here was to have it thin enough that it would run freely, but not so thin it would just spill everywhere. And then I just added this around all the bolt holes, all the rivets, everything I wanted to make pop in the cockpit. The nice thing about an oil wash is it's very easy to clean up with enamel thinner on a clean brush. With all the painting done on the cockpit, it was in time to install the 3D decals, and these were just done with some white glue. That way I was able to move it around a little bit to get it positioned before it would dry and settle in place. While everything was now drying, I then added some more weathering to the floor of the cockpit using some oil paint and a deerfoot stippler. I just used some, I believe it was industrial earth, and blended it in. Later in the video, I'll go a lot more in depth on how I use oil paints, and that should answer some questions how I do this. To replace the throttle that had been removed for the 3D decals, I just used some brass rod and some styrene. Once the throttle was painted, it was time to assemble the nose of the aircraft. Now, while I'm gluing this all together, I do have to give Airfix a lot of credit for this kit. It's quite an improvement over the Sea Fury I built a few years ago by them. Everything went together pretty well and slotted together with no real fit issues, and the only problem I had with the kit was just getting the intakes in place, but we'll address that later. Otherwise, everything went together really well. Once the cockpit sections were together, I then used some black super glue to fill in all the seams. I like using black super glue because it's rubber and it doesn't destroy your files as much as regular CA glue does, and it reduces the chances of you having any ghost seams down the road. And I also use this to fill the seams in the intake trunk and the exhaust of the aircraft as well. With the super glue dry, it was then time to come in with some sanding sponge on a stick to blend everything together. And this is just a slow process of moving up grits of sandpaper until you're happy, and it can take a little bit of time, and don't be surprised if you had to add a little bit more super glue and start again in a few places. While I was building this model kit, I knew I wanted to take it to the PAXCON model show, and I didn't want to have myself caught out by having some seam lines pop back up. Seam lines were going to be an issue later on in the build after I added the intake trunks. I actually had to go back in, refill them and resand them and rescribe them while paint was actually down on the model, but we'll get to that a little bit later. One cool feature about the Buccaneer is the fact that it has a rotating bomb bay. So what this means is instead of having bay doors that open up, slow down the aircraft, create drag, the whole bay itself rotates to expose the ordnance for dropping. Now, Airfix did a pretty good job detailing this, but the back bulkhead's just a blank sheet, and I couldn't really have that with all the reference photos I had. The game plan here was to do some simple scratch building just to make it look more interesting. So the first step was to drill a giant hole in that bulkhead to allow room for the gear mechanism that would actually spin the bay in real life. And this meant going out to the toolbox in the shed and busting out some drill bits that I would use as a mechanic. Once the hole was drilled, everything was cleaned up using a file. Once I was happy with the hole I tore in the bulkhead, it was time to get a piece of styrene tube and cut it down to size so I could replicate the shaft that the bomb bay rotates on. I used a drill bit just to open up the hole a little bit in the shaft so it matched the reference pictures better, and then I put some styrene sheets in behind where it would sit so it would have a better base to glue to. Once I was happy with that, I used some styrene sheets again just to add the framework that the gear rotates on. I did a lot of this work expecting the gear bay to be really visible once the Buck was on its wheels, but it turns out it's not. But that's alright because it gave me a chance to try out some Edward 3D rivets. Once again, I was surprised at how well the kit fit when I was putting the harnesses in the bomb bay. Usually with Airfix there's a lot of cleanup and finagling to get things to seat correctly, but this kit was a pleasant surprise for the most part. Now that the intakes were dry and ready for paint, I used the same gray used in the Southeast Asia camo for the US Air Force. And the reason I did that is this was a very light colored scheme at the end of the day in that desert pink, so I needed all my whites to kind of offset that a little bit. I didn't want the aircraft to seem too light, so a lot of the whites I used were a little bit darker than usual. I painted the intake faces with Tamiya's iron lacquer paint, that new LP line, and then hand painted some acrylic ghost gray on top of it. Once I was happy with that, I then came in with a needle to add some scratching to the front of those turbines. This might seem like a waste of time putting this type of detail in, but the Buccaneer's engines are very easy to see with how far out they sit on the fuselage. It's not like a Hornet where the turbines are tucked back quite a bit further and inwards. Once that was complete, I hit them with a quick wash and then assembled the intake trunk to the face of the turbines. It was then time to paint the gear bays and the section of the engine that is visible. Unfortunately, once you put the landing gear doors on, all of this detail pretty much disappeared. The gear bay was painted the same RAF sky gray as the cockpit, and then the trunks of the engine were painted with a deck tan with a little bit of aluminum in them to give them a shine. After that was painted, the last stage of the engine was painted with Tamiya's gloss aluminum just to break up the colors inside. Because that sky gray was so light, I opted to use Tamiya's dark brown enamel wash to make those details pop. The fit of this gear section made it very easy to pre-paint items before installing them without trying to paint around a giant tube. When assembling the top and lower halves of the fuselage around the wing spars, I was surprised that Airfix tells you to not glue this in a few places, so pay attention to that, because they want you to be able to move things slightly to get a better fit. I was very cautious of that at first, but it seems to have worked out. With the top and lower halves glued in place, one of my favorite things to use to secure them is electrical tape. And the reason I like electrical tape is it tries to rebound a little bit on you when you put it on a surface. If you ever notice when you stretch it, it tries to retract a bit, so that makes it great for securing components together, because it's putting a little bit more oomph on that squeeze. One challenge with the Buccaneer is the way this fuselage is shaped. I couldn't just wrap tape around it completely, because if I squeezed the center of these two sections, it would force the outsides to pop. One of the few negative aspects of this kit is cleaning up the ejector pin marks inside of some of the elevators and the ailerons. Now, not hard to clean this up. I just used a chisel and some sanding sponge, but just keep in mind if you don't clean that up, you're going to run into a lot of fit issues. One thing to be very careful with on this kit is if you squeeze it at all, this seam will pop, so be very careful. Cleanup on the vertical stabilizer was a little bit of a challenge because there is a gap here, but there's also a lot of detail. I would try to use acrylic putty, but one thing I find with acrylic putty is it doesn't bond very well to the plastic. So what I did is I filled in those gaps with some Tamiya gray putty, and then later came in with some Mr. Leveling thinner on a cotton bud and cleaned it up. And that left all that detail in place and very little areas that I had to rescribe. Anytime I've had to do any cleanup on the model, like joining and blending seams, I always use some black primer just to make sure nothing stands out. And in this case, you can see two little areas where I have to come back in and refill it and resand it. But that's the name of the game if you want some clean joins. One thing I really like about the way Airfix engineered this kit was how the two wing halves go together. The lower half is set back a little bit, so the top half of the wing contains the entire leading edge. One thing I'm not a fan of is trying to clean up a seam line right along the leading edge, so it was nice to see that Airfix thought ahead on this, and cleanup was very easy. One thing I noticed when test fitting the folded wings for the kit is that these spars do not fully seat into this piece. So I had to clean this up a little bit to get a nice clean fit. Otherwise, the wings would not fully seat in place. What I noticed when cleaning this piece was it was not square. It almost had a fillet where the vertical and horizontal edges went together. So I had to square that up to get it to fit properly. Now you can see the Mr. Leveling thinner on a Q-tip cleaning up the vertical stab and how little work that leaves afterwards. I ended up getting these cotton swabs off Amazon by accident a few months ago, but they're perfect for cleaning up areas because they don't pull the putty out of place. They physically cannot go down into that gap. Now with the basic cleanup done on the three sections of the aircraft, they all start coming together. And again, the tail fit here was pretty good. I only needed a little bit of putty on that fillet for the tail. Another thing I liked on the way Airfix developed this kit and designed it was that a lot of the pieces on the bottom are separate, so it covers up a lot of the seam line you would normally have to clean. That saves you quite a bit of time during the build. Now here's where I run into the biggest issue with this kit, and again it's a bit of a non-issue. Have you seen it yet? Do you see what's going on here? Even though that nose piece looks like it's sitting aligned with the center fuselage, it's offset by about a half mil. So if I were to rebuild this kit and do it again, what I would do is put a piece of styrene behind the fuselage. That way it forces the nose out a little bit, because what happened was they didn't align properly, so they took a lot of work to clean up that area. For rescribing the wing, we're going to take a page out of the John Chung / Scale Scriber book and just use a simple needle in a pin vise. And I'm going to lightly trace this tape a few times. I'm not going to try to scribe this all in one go. I'm going to make several light passes until I'm happy with how that line looks. And then I'm going to blend it in with a sanding sponge and then use a toothbrush to clean out the leftover styrene. Airfix gives you two separate cockpits for this kit. One has the det cord, one does not. Knowing that I don't have the talent to paint that det cord, I chose to use that canopy to mask the cockpit for painting. But first I had to paint the little bit of a section behind the cockpit that would be covered. For the sandwich shading on this kit, I use RAF Sky Gray, Mr. Color Radome, and then I use a mix of AK Real Color Desert Pink with it being lightened with 2 parts Tamiya Deck Tan. The idea of sandwich shading is it's a form of black basing, but you're adding a lot more depth to the paint before you bring in your later weathering stages, and this is what can make a model really pop. With the turtle deck painting complete, it was time to put the canopy in place to act as a mask. And this keeps out any goobers from getting into the cockpit and causing any problems. I use white glue to secure the cockpit in place because this doesn't create a permanent bond and it's very easy to remove afterwards without damaging any of the paint. Moving into another area that I spent more time than I needed to, I noticed that the bomb bay was missing a lot of the latches and locks that the Buccaneer had. So I got into Fusion 3D, designed these in a few minutes, and then set them up for the printer. And I also set up the shackles for the bombs as well. Unfortunately, once this is all glued into place, you're never going to see it again unless you have the aircraft in flight or on top of a glass shelf. One of the things that Airfix could have improved on was the way they designed the exhaust nozzles for this kit. When I checked my reference photos, the exhaust cans sit pretty much flush to the fuselage, but Airfix had a bit of a gap there and it doesn't touch at all. And there was also a gap around the exhaust nozzle and the fairing it sat inside of, which was not correct for the Buck. So what I did was I got in Fusion 3D, designed a new set of nozzles, and I even thinned them up so they're more close to scale. And while I was in Fusion, I figured why not go a few extra steps, and I actually put in the fuel nozzles for inside the exhaust can. Now, this took a little bit of a light touch to get in place with the super glue, but I found it was well worth it in the end, as it got everything to look right, and it also fit right. If you're interested in picking up a set of these nozzles, you can find them over on the Facebook group for the Buccaneer Model Special Interest Group. I threw them up there for free, and it looks like a few people have been using them since then. The thing with that ridge around the bottom of the nozzle is that keeps you from putting it too far into the fairing, and that gives you the proper offset, and it sits properly inside the fairing. So there you can see there's no gap, and it sits flush against that side of the fuselage. Before you angrily write on your keyboard that, hey, the Buccaneer had flush rivets, you're wasting your time putting rivets on it, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I get it. I understand where you're coming from. However, when I looked at my reference photos of the Buck and Hendon, those rivets are visible in many places due to the wear of the paint. When the RAF painted these Buccaneers to go to Operation Granby, aka Desert Storm, they were temporarily painted desert pink, and the paint they used was not a permanent paint. It heavily wore as soon as it was on the aircraft. These things were still wet almost when they were going on deployment, and with the wear and tear, the desert sun, it didn't take long for that paint to take a beating. Once I had sanded all the rivets flush with some sanding sponge, I then soaked the model with some rubbing alcohol. That way pushed up all the dust from out of the rivets, and then used a cloth to wipe it off. And at this point, I was ready to move into paint. While the body of the model was drying, I used a sanding sponge to thin down the trailing edges of the ailerons for the Buccaneer. These were a little thick, and one of the ways you can improve a model is by thinning things down so they more match the scale. And while I was improving the trailing edge, I thought, why not improve the actuators for the ailerons and put some brass rod in and drill out the holes so it looks like the rod is actually going into the wing. That is one of the coolest things about the Cold War jets before we got into computers and hydraulics and fly-by-wire and all that stuff, was a lot of these aircraft were still using bell cranks and cables to fly. And this jet was doing 600 knots. And if I wasn't 100% sure before, I was definitely sure after I had the rods in place and test fitted them on the aircraft and realized how visible that was going to be. After checking a few other references of the wingtip lights, I decided the easiest way to recreate those would be simply drill a hole inside the clear styrene and drop some paint in afterwards. The nice thing about clear styrene is it's very hard, so you can take your time drilling through it without having to worry about punching through to the other side. Anytime you're drilling holes in styrene though, you want to start with a small drill bit and then work your way up to the size you want. If you just try to drill it with the biggest drill bit right away, you run the risk of cracking the styrene. Once the paint had dried inside, I just used some MLT on a cloth to wipe it off, so now I have a nice clean navigation light. One other thing being replaced on this kit was the Pitot tube. That's a little bit too thick for me, and Master Club has some metal ones that you can replace it with. One tip for avoiding dusting around intakes in tight areas on model kits is to paint them before you install the intakes. This gives you a little bit easier access. You can sand the paint flush if you get some dusting before you add in the intakes. Now with those areas pre-painted, I can install the intakes and paint the exteriors. Now, again, you can't quite see it in this photo, but right below the cockpit where that diagonal seam line is, does not sit flush on the kit, and it's going to cause some issues here. Unfortunately, it wasn't fully visible until I had the pink paint on and could see it a lot better. I'm using a gallery swallowtail airbrush for use for the base painting, and the reason I like this is I have a big 0.5 needle in it and allows me to cover a lot more area in less time, and that helps speed things up a little bit and it gives me a nice smooth finish. Now it's time to get into the main paint of the kit, and here's where my weathering process starts. I don't like completely flat solid paint. I like it to have some depth, and by building up in thin layers over different colors, it really helps sell faded, worn paint. One challenge I was going to have with this paint though is it's a super light color, and I didn't think it was going to cover very well. So my base colors were very light as well. I started off with some Mr. Color RAF Sky Gray again, and then I stole a trick from the armor modelers and used some Radome Tan in the highest points of the model to add some visual interest. And I think they call this forced contrast, but the idea here is it's going to make the aircraft look more dynamic and give the impression that it's a lot more well lit than it really is. With the base layer set, I then came in with the first blend coat of Desert Pink. Now the idea here is I do not want full 100% coverage. I still want some of that texture underneath to show through. So I just apply thin, light coats and slowly build this all up. That is going to give me a lot of control for how much of this texture is going to show through the paint. This might seem drastic at first, but by the time you come in with oils, your panel line washes, and all that other fun stuff, it is going to push this back quite a bit. So the more dramatic it is to start with, the more of it you'll have show through with the final product. Now this is probably going to be one of the more controversial moments in this build because of the color I chose to use. There's going to be people that say this isn't pink enough, other people say it's too light, and you can't really please all the people all the time. So what I did when I was in the RAF Museum last year, I took a white piece of paper and put it on the side of the nose of the aircraft and took a couple pictures with my phone. I turned off all the HDR stuff, all the things that enhance the photo, and tried to get a sample of the color by photo. When I was in the museum, it was a dark, rainy English day, so I didn't have the best lighting for the photo, so some of it is still an interpretation. Looking at photos taken during the Gulf War, the aircraft looked very light, and it was really hard to come to a solid decision on what was the right color paint to use. So this might not be the 100% correct color, but it was something I was happy enough I could live with it. And then it was time to lighten that color some more with some more deck tan and start bringing in some highlights using some post shading. Normally post shading is something I've not done, but again, I'm stealing this trick from the armor modelers. I want this paint to look very distressed because again, we're looking at 20-year-old paint on an aircraft that was sitting outside for a considerable amount of time. Again, this may look drastic right now, but when you start adding in all of your oils and pin washes, it's going to push that all back. It's a little bit of a trick here that you have to fight your brain and allow it to be this dramatic. Part of your brain is going to tell you this is too much, but that's when you should stop. It was about this time I realized my intake seam lines didn't look correct, so I had to fill them with some Tamiya putty, sand them flush, and then come in and touch up the paint. All in all, this only set me back a couple of hours while I painted and re-scribed the lines. Now, I'm happy with it, and I'm ready to carry on. One interesting thing about Airfix's take on the Buccaneer is the hydraulic lines are on the insides of the landing gear legs, but there's nothing on the outside. Now, this is something that's a very quick thing to fix with some styrene and lead wire, but should you choose to not do this, it's okay, because you'll later find out when you put the landing gear door on, it covers up about 90% of that strut. But now that I'd fixed my panel lines up by the intakes, I was feeling confident and motivated enough to put a little bit more effort into the build. Full disclosure, when I checked out those panel lines, I put the aircraft back on the shelf because I wasn't ready to deal with that. I also had some areas on the horizontal stab that had to be filled in with styrene and cleaned up because I had some gaps once I installed the elevators. So all in all, I didn't think I had time to finish cleaning up the kit before PAXCon, so I busted out a Hellcat from Edward. While I was working on the Hellcat, there was an incident that involved my 9-year-old daughter, baby chicks, and the modeling bench. You don't need details, but the Hellcat decided to identify as an Air India 787 pilot, and I think that explains enough. But it did leave me in a bit of a conundrum because I wanted to have a new fresh build to take to PAXCon. So with 11 days before I was wheels up with Air Canada, the Buccaneer came back to the bench at the stage you're seeing now. With the brake lines in place, it was in time to bust out the Reskit accessories going on this kit, and the first and foremost was one of their sidewinders. Now, this might not be the exact model sidewinder that was loaded up on the Buccaneer, but it was close enough to me that it would work. And the nice thing about Reskit's sidewinders, they actually give you the caps and stuff to put on the missiles for when the aircraft's on standby. Now, full disclosure, the RAF Hendon Buccaneer doesn't have any weapons on it, so this is a little bit of an interpretation from reference photos of the Gulf War, but I decided to go with it. There's also going to be some eagle-eyed viewers here that notice this is the wrong laser-guided bomb for the Buccaneer. However, when I ordered the stuff from Reskit, it said British Paveway 2 and it had Buccaneer on the box, so I went with it. And there's not really that much difference that you can notice, and it was going to work for the build. I like the colors that the Brits used on their smart bombs, and that made this pop a little bit more. So even though it's not the exact bomb I needed, it made the model more interesting to look at. So if you're a perfectionist, you're probably not going to want this one, but I liked it, and it made everything else around it pop, so that's why I went with it. As always, the Reskit stuff was very tidy and very neatly done and has a lot of great detail. And it made it very easy to paint this. The colors I used on the Paveway were the linoleum deck brown. Actually, the first time I think I've ever used that color. I used gunship green from Mr. Color for the main body, and then I used Mr. Color's olive drab for the fins and the seeker head. Then for the band clamps on the bomb, I used AK 3rd Gen Silver, which is an acrylic, and then any little areas that need to be touched up, I could just come in with a toothpick and simply scrape them off. Then it was sealed everything with semi-gloss paint and add a wash to it. Now that the base paint and the decals were down on the model, it was time to move into the next step, which is chipping. And this is something I've never really had to do much of on an aircraft, maybe a couple chips here and there on pylons or the nose, but this is the first time I was going to have to aggressively chip a model. When the RAF painted these Buccaneers, they were only painted in a temporary desert pink that wasn't supposed to last very long, and being a temporary paint, it didn't hold up very well to handling, scratches, bumps, any of the usual stuff aircraft on a flight line would have, especially when they're flying through the desert air at a few hundred miles an hour and running up against all the sand. It's basically like taking sandpaper to the aircraft. To set the base chipping, I decided the easiest thing to do would grab a sponge, tear it up a little bit, and then offload as much paint as possible before applying it to the model. Now what you'll see here is I'm actually unloading it on the side of the paint tray, because I have too much on there to start with. Now I'm going to unload it into this cloth, and once it's leaving little chippy pieces on the cloth, it's ready for the kit. There we go. Now that I'm happy with how much is being left over, out comes the plastic, and apparently the time. Now I'm going to lightly apply the sponge to the model. I'm not going to mash this down, and it's going to leave mostly random specks on the paint. Now what you'll notice after a few presses is that you do get a pattern, and human brains love patterns, so I have to keep turning the sponge just to change up the way that it's leaving specks on the paint. And if I'm not entirely happy with it, I can always come in with a brush and tidy stuff up. The heaviest areas of chipping on the RAF Hindenburg were at that actuator rod for the aileron and down where the wing fold happened. The nice thing about this build is I had dozens of reference photos I could use. After setting the base for the chipping with the sponges, it was then time to come in with a 000 brush with a very fine point and just start lightly drawing in scratches where I wanted them to be, just to replicate the aircraft. There are definitely a few areas in the paint where the pink had just flaked off completely, exposing the gray underneath. And this is easy to do with the brush because then I can just tie some of the bigger chips together. Access panels, hinges, anywhere the crew would be maintaining seem to be the areas that would have the most damage to the paint. Now, this might look excessive right now, but remember, when I come in with the pin washes and the oils, this is all going to get pushed back quite a bit. You have to remember as well, this isn't so much the paint chipping as it is flaking off in entire pieces. Again, I bust out my gallery swallowtail brush with its 0.5 needle and lay down a nice flat coat of paint to set the base for the oil work that's about to start. The nice thing about having that 0.5 needle ready to go is it makes it much easier to cover a large surface area. And the Buccaneer is actually quite a large aircraft compared to the size of a Hornet, so it definitely saves you a lot of time. And time is the one accessory for modeling we cannot buy. Before moving on to the oils for this build, I decided to try the ammo shaders and use the grime. And now this is basically a thinned down acrylic ink, but I instantly loved it because it allows you to slowly build up layers. Now, if you watch here, this is all in real time, you can see that it doesn't make that much of a difference on the first pass, but it doesn't take much to slowly build it up. And just before I moved into oil work, I noticed that I hadn't painted any of the aluminum surfaces yet of the aircraft, so I had to hit pause, tape it up, and then flyer down some more paint. And one thing I've learned with the shinier paints, like your metallizers and stuff like that, is they like to get everywhere. So I completely covered the model with some tape and paper so no irritant specks would get anywheres. Now I was ready to move into the pin washes. Most of my pin washes I make from oil paint and some enamel thinner, just like earlier in the video. And I know this is at the right viscosity when it tries to run along the panel line on its own. So here it's a little thin still, but later on I get the mixture right and you can see it starts to run itself down the panel line. That's right where I want it to be. Once the pin wash is dry, I use a shop cloth with some enamel thinner to wipe away the excess. The nice thing about shop cloths is they're designed to not leave lint in places, so you don't have to worry about finding those on your model later on down the road. Another check of my reference photos showed that some of the latches for the engine inspection panels had the aluminum showing, so I decided to come in with a fine tip brush and just tap this in a few places to add that interest. Then before moving into the oil paint rendering, I decided to assemble the remaining parts of the model. Now, you might ask why I'm doing that now. Well, with the wings folded, it's going to give me a good guide of where the regular wear points would be, like where the crew would be accessing, where they'd be walking on the aircraft, what they would have access to. And this is also an important step because this is when the aircraft's going to start telling a story. And if I do all my oil painting first and then assemble it, it may not make as much sense as it did earlier. So this pretty much sets up the final guide for the oil work. One mistake I made when building this kit is I left the metal pitot tube off right until the end and glued it in place, but then I realized I had a weird seam line there that I had to clean up and delete. So I had to basically pucker up my butthole and add some super glue and sand it flush and repaint just that small area of the wing without knocking off anything. It was a bit of a pucker factor, but I managed to pull that off. The last thing to go on was the in-flight refueling probe, because we all know what happens to this type of thing when you glue it on too early in the build. That's using a metal probe, and it looks great painted. I highly recommend you replace the kit part with that because it adds a little bit of interest. One last update to the kit was replacing these antennas on the back of the aircraft. Now, Airfix gives you a tube which is way out of scale, and the easiest thing I find to use is the bristles of a toothbrush. The nice thing about these is they're thin and they're in scale, but best of all, if you accidentally bump it, it'll bend, it doesn't break off. So I just cut this off the toothbrush and use some super glue to secure it in place. Airfix calls out for these to be painted white on the aircraft, but my reference photos show that they were also the same desert pink as the rest of the aircraft, with just the tip of the receiver being black. So I masked everything off after painting and then glued on the bristle. These are also a great thing to use for your 148th aircraft if you need static wicks, so if you're doing an F-16 where they're very prominent, or any other type of aircraft, it will save you some headaches. Now, why use a toothbrush bristle over just a regular paint bristle? Well, the toothbrush is a little bit stiffer, so it's less prone to droop over time. Now, with a final pass of rubber black paint, they're ready to be glued onto the vertical stab of the buck. And in my opinion, that looks a lot better than the massive tube coming off the back of the kit part. Now let's dive into the oil paint work on this kit, and this is where the model really pops. What I've done here is I've put down some oil paints I'm going to use onto a white piece of cardboard. That gives me a good idea what that paint color looks like, and then I start applying some thinner. And I want to basically make this thin enough that it has some pigment in it, but not so thin it turns into a glaze. Now I'm going to take that paintbrush, I'm going to unload as much paint as I can because I don't want an excess on the model. I want this to be a slow, controlled process. And I'm just going to put little dots in the area that makes sense, where all your maintenance guys are going to be leaving greasy fingerprints, where they're going to be accessing hatches. And one of the nice things about those ammo shaders is I've kind of set up the base work for where I'm going to put some of the oils. You can see the darker part of the paint, and I'm just going to enhance that with some of the oils. Now, I don't want to do this everywhere because 2 years ago I built a MiG-21 and it was one of the first times I did a lot of the oil paint work, and it looked terrible when I got it to the show and seen the other models next to it. So I definitely wanted to refine my oil work a bit more, and I found that less is more in some of these areas. And it also helped having some great reference photos. I'm sure the museum washed this jet down before it got put on display, but there's still a lot of stuff there you can reference. Now this process, again, is not something you're going to do in one pass. This is going to take 3 or 4 layers to get this to build up properly. Right now this looks kind of weird because I have just dots sitting there, but what I'm going to do once all this is laid out, I'm going to come in with a clean brush, I'm going to dampen it a little bit in enamel thinner, and then I'm going to start to blend those in. I'm going to take away those harsh edges, and that's going to push the oil work back a little bit. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to dry this with a hairdryer. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to do it again. I'm going to add in some more dots on top of that and then blend it again and keep repeating that until I'm happy with how it looks. Here you can see the second layer of dots getting blended in, and I'm using different style brushes. Like the more raggedy will give me different effects, Deerfoot stipplers will give me great effects, and then big soft brushes as well to blend everything. And while the Guinness Girls Big Milkers are in view, I might as well make the comment that when I was at the Hendon Museum, I had a woman talking to me. She may have been one of the curators there, and she was talking about how they painted over that in the museum to make it more politically correct. And I kind of laughed and I said, do you not see why that's redundant and why that's ridiculous? And she said, no, why? And I said, well, this aircraft was designed to carry nuclear weapons and nuke a Soviet ship and kill 1,000 guys in one shot, but we're going to get upset that there's tits on it? That kind of blows my mind. Anyways, back to the model. We're cleaning up the last bit of oils here, and we're pretty much ready for the photos. A quick review of this kit. For Airfix, it was actually really nice. I like the refined panel lines, and that was one of the biggest complaints I always had about Airfix. They're nice and thin, and they hold a wash really well, and this has been a big improvement over their kits since the Sea Fury. And in fact, I enjoyed it so much, I'm probably going to build their Sea King early next year. That's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the extended look at the weathering, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and leave your comments in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I still got the paint wrong, whatever you want to do. I am the Model Guy, and I'll talk to you next time. Now for the pin washes, I'm just using, again, some thinned down Abteilung Starship Filth paint, but I'm only using the darkest pin washes for the access panels. I'm not going to use this in areas that don't make sense, just to break up, and the pug's barking in the background.